Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. Stay tuned until the end for a special offer. Hi everyone, thank you all so much for joining me in today's video. Today I'll be sharing an oil painting tutorial on how to paint hands. If you'd like to see a 60-minute version of this video along with color mixing instructions and live commentary, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/happydartist. The reference photo I'm using today is from Pexels, which is a royalty-free image site. So I'll be leaving the photographer's information as well as a link to this specific reference photo in the video description if you all want to follow along or just to show the photographer some love. And I'll actually only be using two colors for this piece. The first is cadmium red medium, which is a nice solid kind of primary red. And the second is terre verte. Pardon my crappy French pronunciation, but it's basically a very cool muted earthy green. And when I mix this really bright red and this earthy green together, they make beautiful varying shades of cool, kind of more natural looking skin tones. So I always get asked how to mix skin tones. I've made several videos about it, but you can never make too much. In this one, I'll be showing you how you really don't need that many colors. All you need are two good starting points in order to make a wide range of skin tones that helps make the subject look very realistic and human. One thing I do want to point out is that the cadmium red medium is extremely saturated and highly pigmented. So whenever I'm mixing, the ratio is usually a lot more green and a little bit less red. So if you don't want to waste your paint, I would suggest just starting off with a little bit of red and slowly tweaking the color until you get it right. Also make sure to add titanium white or any white that you prefer into your skin tone mixture, because if you don't, it turns out looking just really dark brown, and sometimes it's hard to tell the exact hue of the color. So adding in a little bit of white actually helps bring out the true shade or the true hue of the color. And I also do want to mention that the reason why I love using this particular combination, the cadmium red medium and terre verte, is because I think you can have a lot more granular control when you start off mixing a red and a green. Red and green are complementary colors, and complementary colors usually do a great job of canceling each other out. So reducing the saturation levels, as well as mixing a brand new color at the same time. So instead of starting out with a pre-mixed brown or like a pre-mixed tan, such as maybe burnt sienna or raw umber, I like to start off with a red and a green because I can slowly have control over how rosy and warm and pink I want the skin tone to be, or maybe how cool and more brownish and more earthier I want the skin tone to be. So obviously, to have it feel more rosy and blushing, you can add more red, and to have it be more neutral and less red, you add more green into the mixture. So I found that starting off with red and green is always resulting in a better skin tone mixing experience for me than starting off with a brown. With a brown, I can only change how light and dark it is. I can't really change the hue. So just a little quick tip in case anyone listening wants to build up a color palette for skin tones, but not want to have to spend too much money to buy too many colors. You can accomplish a lot with just red and green. And as usual, I'll be listing all of my art supplies in the video description if you guys want to try them out for yourself. So up until this point, I had mixed a very light peachy color for my sketching portion of the painting. Because it's going to be painted over, I usually like to start off with a light color to just lay down the basic composition and measure out the proportions. Now I'm going in with chromatic black to fill up just the left side of the background. Because I'm right-handed, I will be resting my hand on the panel, and so I don't want to get the right side too wet. That's why I only chose the left side to kind of fill up the background. And the reason why I'm starting with the background first is because it's the darkest value on this painting. I always like to work my way from the darkest values up to the lightest, and by laying down that darkest value before I start anything else, I'm able to kind of establish a visual boundary on what the extreme ends of my value spectrum look like. So obviously the white is the white from the painting panel. That's going to be the whitest white I can possibly achieve on this painting. And then the darkest value will be this black background. And having those two opposite ends of the spectrum established early on helps me fill in the gradient of midtone values more precisely without having to rework too much. A common annoyance that I bump into during the painting or even drawing process is I'll start off sometimes with just the midtones, and then the second I add in the darkest value adjacent to the midtones, it kind of washes everything out. And I realize that the contrast is just not high enough in the midtones for it to stand out against the dark black background. Having the absolute darkest value laid down after you've established the midtones results in just the midtones feeling very flat, and you just have to go in and reapply the second to darkest value, the third to darkest value, in order to build up to your highlights. So I find that if I just start off with the darkest values first, right off the bat, it prevents me from having to waste time in reworking things. I can just already know my starting point and what I have to build up towards and where I have to build up from, if that makes sense. For the darkest parts of the hand, if you can take a look quickly at the reference photo, it appears that the light source is shining from the right side, and so therefore the darkest shadows on the hand are going to be on the left side. Those I am mixing cadmium red medium, a little bit of terre verte, and a touch of the chromatic black. It's going to not only darken the shadow's values, but also desaturate it a bit. And desaturation is a huge, very useful tool for if you're painting cool skin tones. You almost want to always desaturate the colors that you mix straight out of the tube. And adding white or black into your highlights and shadows is a great way to bring down some of those saturation levels so that your skin tones look nice and cool instead of super sun-kissed and bright. Now I'm adding in bits of very saturated reds and pinks to give the fingertips, parts of the palm, a little bit of extra blush, similar to how I paint facial features. I think that even with a body part like the hand, where it's definitely not usually expressive, it doesn't have eyes or a nose or a mouth, you can still add some character and personality by warming up certain parts to be rosier and have almost like a blush-like effect. And having a few areas pop out and feel different from the rest also just gives the hand a lot more life and makes it feel a lot more interesting than if I stuck to kind of the same shades of beige or tan. You can kind of see it a little bit in the reference photo, but I like to always bring out those spots of color that's very different. I always like to exaggerate those parts because it just gives the piece so much more visual interest and variety. Also, just a quick side note about the one layer process of this piece. I know it's very different from my usual method of building and refining and getting all my blending super smooth and perfect through several layers. This one, I really wanted it to reflect the nature of just making a quick study for the sake of practicing instead of needing everything to be perfect or super polished. So getting it all done in one layer, I actually didn't use any painting mediums. I found that if you want thick, opaque coverage and to be able to have the painting feel as complete as you can get it within just one layer, I always like to avoid using mediums because they tend to make the oil paint more transparent and you'll see a lot of the painting panel kind of seep through underneath. So getting rid of mediums also helps make the entire painting process a lot easier. There's way less you have to manage or worry about. And it's especially useful to avoid using mediums in painting sessions like this one, where it's technically only one layer because I did this painting in one session, but I can still build paint on top of other paint, and kind of to give the illusion of more layer or just to have more coverage by carefully using the fat over lean rule, meaning that the layers underneath have to be thin, have less paint, and if you're using mediums, less medium. But since we're not worrying about that, it's a huge hassle we don't have to consider. All you have to worry about is that you lay down your initial like underpainting sketch or your initial first attempt or your first pass to be thin paint, thin brush strokes. It doesn't really matter if you can still see a little bit of the white of the panel underneath. And then as you refine the details and build more paint on top, you can slowly use more and more paint so that basically the thickness or the volume of the paint increases as you lay more paint on top of the other. If it's the opposite, you'll find that it's really hard to try to lay down a thin layer of paint on an area that's already coated in a thick layer of paint. So working with fat over lean is extremely helpful in cases where you're trying to get a lot done in just one sitting. And lastly, I wanted to quickly talk about the anatomy of the hand. I know that all of us have hands that look extremely different, so I don't want to talk too much about measuring the length of the fingers and in relation to the palms and things like that. We all have such different hands, and men's hands and women's hands look very different. In general, though, just a rough, extremely generalized approach is I find that the fingers are usually around the same length as the palm. So another thing I would like to keep in mind is there are joints on the fingers. So whenever you paint a hand, even if the pose has the fingers being straight, keep those joints in mind and make sure to make the joints stand out. The joints usually bulge out a little bit compared to the rest of the finger. So you'll find that if you don't acknowledge the joints at all, like if you don't add a little bit of a wrinkle or a slight curve to symbolize the joint bone sticking out, it'll make the hand feel very fake, almost like a Barbie doll's hand. So human hands, even when our fingers are stretched out completely straight, there's still some acknowledgement of the joint. When our fingers are straight, there's a little wrinkle, and then when our fingers are bent, obviously the joints are the areas where you see the bend. Lastly, and this is a tip that I learned from a lot of trial and error, the fingers themselves are actually not cylindrical in shape. I know if you're trying to simplify the shape of the fingers down to something recognizable and geometric, they almost feel like they should be perfect long cylinders, but I found that they're actually more like long rectangular blocks, kind of like a French fry. So to me, in the past, whenever I shaded fingers, I would assume they were like a perfectly round cylinder, and I would shade the gradient from the shadows to highlights in a perfectly blended, smooth way, the same way I would shade a cylinder. And the fingers always ended up looking strange, like they looked like little hot dogs. And slowly over time, I realized that the shape of our fingers actually looks more like a French fry. So it's actually more like a rectangular prism with rounded edges. And ever since I discovered that, I found that I can shade hands to look a lot more realistic if I try to avoid the hot dog finger syndrome. And that about wraps up today's video. Thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this, and I hope that it was useful and that I was able to help teach you a little bit about painting hands and mixing skin tones. I am going to try to do more videos like this that aren't these epic large oil paintings, but rather small, focused studies that just hone in on one specific subject or one specific area to paint. So feel free to let me know if there are any other body parts or subjects that you have been struggling with and you would like to see a tutorial of. Also, since it looks like quarantine isn't ending anytime soon, I decided why not keep extending my spring sale into June. So if you want 20% off of your order of anything from my shop, including originals, just enter the code SPRING at happyd-artist.com, and the sale will end June 30th. And if you're interested in learning more about how to paint and draw, I have lots of art educational content on my Patreon page, including exclusive video tutorials, step-by-step photo tutorials, live streams, podcasts, and even surprise art gift boxes. all available at patreon.com/happydartist. I'd love to have you join my Patreon family. I wanted to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video and for supporting my channel and the art community. I've actually enjoyed using Squarespace for 4 years now to build and host my online shop and website. So whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and visit squarespace.com/happydartist for 10% off your first purchase. Also, if you want to check out more artworks, works in progress, and just random daily artist adventures, feel free to check out my Instagram, and you can follow me at the handle @happydartist.